Hi guys, I hope you're doing great, and in this video we're going to be discussing about the consequences of the current account surplus. Now before I begin the video, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, just go and click the subscribe button. So let's start. So guys, first of all, why does a current account surplus arises? So a current account surplus would arise whenever the inflows, or you can say the export revenues from the balance of trade, or the investment income, that is the factor income, and the current transfers would exceed the amount of outflows, you can say, or the import expenditures from them, right? For them, in fact. So simply it means that the amount of exports or the inflows exceed the amount of our outflows, right? In other words, the value of the export revenues exceed the value of the import expenditures. Okay guys, so that's current account surplus, but we need to know that, what are the consequences of a current account surplus, what are the impacts of a current account surplus, how does it impact the economy, and this is the main topic of this video. So guys, the first that I've written is that, if the current account is in a surplus, that would mean that the country's balance of trade is in surplus, that is balance of visible and invisible trade, both, right? So that would mean that the balance of trade would be in a surplus, which means that if that's the case, if our balance of trade is in a surplus, it means that the net exports, right, is positive, right? The value of the net exports is positive, which means that obviously exports are exceeding our imports, and that is why the balance of trade is in a surplus, right? Both for goods and services. And if that's the case, it obviously means that our aggregate demand would be rising, because if our net exports are rising, that is the value of the exports exceed the value of the imports, that would definitely increase the aggregate demand in the economy. And a rise in aggregate demand itself has a lot of positive impacts on the economy, such as it increases employment, right? It has an effect on employment, it has an effect on GDP, it has an effect on tax revenues, right? And we're going to see that how does a balance of trade surplus would actually increase aggregate demand, and what are the positive impacts of AD that will happen on the economy. So first of all, whenever you're going to be writing this point, because guys, for answering 12-mark questions, you need to make diagrams as well, because a diagram is part of the assessment objective 3, which is analysis. So you have to make the diagram. Okay, so if you're saying that a current account surplus would mean that the balance of trade is in a surplus, since that's a major balance of trade is a major component of the current account, and it determines whether the current account would be in a deficit or a surplus, right? So obviously that will have an impact on AD, right? So if you're saying that AD is rising, make sure that you draw a diagram as well. So you're going to be drawing the Keynesian diagram, and we're going to say that your aggregate demand is rising. Okay guys, so I've drawn the diagram here, and this diagram is telling us that a rise in aggregate demand shifts the AD curve to the right, that is AD1, and the new equilibrium is at point B, and the old equilibrium was at point A, right? And it's clearly, we can clearly see that our national income is rising from Y1 to Y2, and so is our little bit price level increasing from, let's say, P1 to P2. Now, the positive impact of all of this is that if the balance of trade is in a surplus and AD is rising, it would increase our national income from Y1 to Y2, which we can see in the diagram that our national income or our real GDP is increasing from Y1 to Y2, and that would definitely have a great impact on our employment as well, because the demand, if the demand for goods and services is increasing, since obviously if you're exporting more, the export industry is growing, the firms in the export industry need to hire more labor to produce those goods to export, right? And that would, because we know that the demand for labor is derived demand, so they would hire more labor, and that would increase the employment rate in the economy and provide more employment opportunities to a lot of domestic workers. So that is why the employment will increase. And remember that when employment increases, so does incomes increase, because a rise in employment would increase the incomes in the economy, and a rise in incomes would definitely have an impact on the amount of consumer goods that are being consumed, right? So definitely, and that is why we say that it has a multiplier effect on our national incomes, and because a rise in AD does have a multiplied rise in national income as well. Again, like I said, tax revenues would also rise. The more, if national income is rising, definitely tax revenues would rise. Revenues from income taxes, revenues from sales taxes, revenues from corporate taxes, all three would rise, right? Because if consumers are spending that money, definitely they will be paying more in sales taxes, and if employment is rising, then more revenues from income taxes. If the export industry is growing, then more revenue from corporate taxes as well. So right, so you need to explain all three, that how does a tax revenue is rising, right? It would have a good impact on your answer. And a rise in tax revenues would be spent back on the economy for providing, let's say, free goods, or for providing public goods, or essential public services, or maybe investment in infrastructure, public parks, education, right? So this we can clearly see is a positive consequence of a current account surplus, because a current account surplus is primarily or majorly into a surplus because of a balance of trade surplus, right? Because that's a major component of the current account. All the investment income is also a, you know a, an important component of your current account, but balance of trade is the major component of the current account and has the potential and the capacity and the tendency to either put the current account into a deficit or a surplus. So guys, this is the diagram, and this Keynesian model is simply telling us that our aggregate demand is rising and so is our employment. And you can also say that this is resulting into actual growth, because actual growth means that you are utilizing your existing resources to increase the output. So basically this increase in aggregate demand will result into actual growth, which will cause our national income to rise from Y1 to Y2, because it shows that we have the spare capacity. And a rise in aggregate demand, as this diagram is telling us, pushes the economy very close to full employment, although the full employment would be at this point, that is point C, but it's at least close to full employment. But that's not, it's up to you. You want to show, if you can also show that the economy moves close to full employment, that is itself a positive sign. Or if you wanted to show that you want to tell the examiner that the economy moves exactly at full employment, you can shift the aggregate demand to an extent where this AD1 shifts to point C, and then this becomes your YFE, that is national income, that is full employment level of national income, right? But that's up to you, whatever you want to show. It's the student's own preference. So guys, this is it. And then okay, so guys, there's actual growth taking place. The economy now moves closer to the full employment level of national income. There's economic growth, and part of the economic growth is because of actual growth. And then the economy is utilizing its spare capacity to increase output, and results into a rise in real GDP and national income, and the economy moves now closer to the full employment. And you could also make a small macro PPC as well, if you have time or you want to impress the examiner. That is that the movement from A to B shows that we are now close to the level of full employment, because any point on the production possibility curve shows that full employment level of national income has been achieved, or full employment. There's full employment of resources, right? Now, point number 2, that is one of the consequences of a current account surplus. The second consequence of a current account surplus would be that it would result into unemployment decreasing, right? And we've already covered, by the way, this point in part 1 as well, but then let me just do it again. So if unemployment is decreasing, it means that since demand for labor is derived demand, so firms would hire more labor, and since they need more workers to produce that extra output, so it would obviously reduce the unemployment in the economy. And from this point we could also connect that this would also result into a decline in poverty and improvement in living standards, as this would become part of your analysis assessment objective 3, right? But then there's another thing that is happening in the economy, and that is if the aggregate demand is rising, so it results into inflationary pressures from P1 to P2. Okay guys, now one major thing that I want to mention over here is that it also depends upon what is your style of writing, or how the language of economics is being delivered or communicated through a medium of the language. Guys, is very important. So a lot of students just jump to saying there's demand for inflation in the economy, and oh my god, there's a lot of problems have arisen. It's not that the case. A bit of demand for inflation is not a problem if the rate of inflation is within the limits, right? If the rate of inflation is within the targeted rate of the state, so that's not a problem. So don't just jump by saying, oh my god, so there's a problem that is now in the economy. Don't just jump to conclusions, right? So a better way would be that, if you can see from the diagram as well, so if aggregate demand is rising and prices are moving upwards, there's an upward pressure on the prices. So you could say that it results into inflationary pressure. There's demand pull inflationary pressure, right? And right now at this moment we're not commenting whether this demand pull inflationary pressure is healthy or bad for the economy, because that's not the point we're trying to make over here. We're just telling that This is the consequence. This demand pull inflationary pressure will be on the economy. Now, it could be bad for the economy as well. It could be good for the economy as well. It depends upon a lot of other factors. It depends upon the rate of inflation and etc. And that's not the point of discussion right now. So there will be demand pull inflationary pressures in the economy, since we know that, and the main reason for demand pull inflationary pressures is that the spare capacity is now being utilized, and since you can see that we're closer to full employment, right? Because if you're closer to full employment, the price level has to rise, because there's a lot of pressure. And the reason is that there's a lot of pressure on our existing factors of production, and that results into an upward pressure, and that feeds through higher prices in the economy, and that results into inflationary pressures in the economy, right? So that is point number 3, and that is the third consequence of a current account surplus. Now, guys, moving to the fourth consequence. So the fourth consequence is that the current account surplus puts in upward pressure on the exchange rate, right? So it increases the external value of the currency in terms of the other currency. That is, it appreciates the exchange rate. Now, why does this happen? Because it's a current account surplus, so definitely the demand for the currency would outstrip the supply of the currency. So demand for the currency would outstrip the supply of the currency, right? So let's suppose the demand for pounds would be greater than the supply of pounds. Because obviously, if your current account is in a surplus, so it means that your net exports are high, right? Or net exports are positive. So definitely demand for the currency would outstrip the supply of the currency. And remember that the stronger the exchange rate, the more stronger your currency is, the more beneficial it is for the importer. So for the importer who's going to be importing raw materials, right? So since appreciation, so let's say if a pound is, let's say, $10, and if a pound gets $20 now, so obviously for the UK importers, for the UK firms, it's quite cheaper now to import raw materials, since they're able to get $20 worth of raw materials for the same amount, right? So the price of imports fall, and if the price of imports fall, the key raw materials, the cost of the key raw materials would fall. And as a result of that, they would be able to purchase cheaper raw materials from the US, and that would make their production more competitive. And hence, what will happen is that it is going to reduce the cost of production in the economy, and it will shift the SRAS to the right, and that is going to culminate into lower cost push inflationary pressures. Now here, I'm not going to be drawing the diagram for SRAS shifting to the right, but again, it's the same diagram where your SRAS will shift to the right, and it's going to reduce the cost push inflation. So lower cost push inflationary pressures, right? Perfect. So now, but then that is for the importer. For the importer, it is beneficial, right? But what about the exporter? If the value of the currency appreciates, that is not good for your exporters. Why? Because for a net exporter, the exports would become expensive, or it would become dearer, right? So exports become expensive, and that is not good, and your imports become cheaper. So for the net exporter, that is not something that is beneficial for the net exporter. And the reason is, so a lot of people in your exam would be right, it's not beneficial for the net exporter. Now here you just stated it, you stated your comment, right? You haven't really explained it, so you have to explain it, right? So that why is it not good for the net exporter? Now you guys need to understand that the economic theory suggests us that if your imports become cheaper, so demand for imports rises, right? And as a result of that, your import expenditure will definitely increase as well. But since the demand for your exports is falling, so what's going to happen is that your export revenues would go down, right? So if import expenditure is rising and export revenues are falling, what is going to happen is that the outflow would exceed the amount of inflows, right? So there's more money going out of the economy than money coming in the economy, because your export revenues are falling. Now the impact of this effect would be that since your import expenditure exceeds your export revenues, it's going to cancel or offset it's going to cancel or offset the previous current account surplus. So basically it's going to worsen, it's going to cancel or offset the current account surplus. That's going to have a worsening impact on your trade balance. It's going to have a worsening impact on balance of trade, since it's going to cancel out the previous surplus. And that is why we say that in a floating exchange rate, the deficits are automatically adjusted and the surpluses are automatically adjusted as well. They're offset. They don't persistently remain there. Why? Because the appreciation, because of the subsequent impacts of appreciation and depreciation. So this is it, guys. This is what's going to happen as far as your imports, your effect on your importers and your exporters are concerned. So the exporters won't like it. The exporters are not going to enjoy, because they will definitely have a negative impact in terms of declining export revenues. And then what's going to happen is that the export sector would go down, the export industry would go down. And for a developing country, let's say if the developing country is growing and is quite dependent in terms of GDP on the export revenues, if exports form a significant portion of GDP and employment, so that would have worsening consequences for that developing economy, right? So I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. I'll see you all around in the next video. Until then, take care.